Scott, welcome to the MedTech Unboxed Podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great to see you a couple weeks ago in MD&M Minneapolis. We got to meet for the first time and talk a little bit about some of the things you're doing, a lot of the things you're doing, and it really caught my attention about MRI compatible implantable pacing leads. So thanks for taking some time.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing your show too. I mean, a lot of us in the MedTech community love your show, and it's very informative. And we needed the MedTech community needed a platform like yours to help people understand kind of the state of the industry, right?
Yeah.
And especially what type of new technologies are being developed.
Absolutely.
So
it's
thanks
all
for
about
having
people
me.
absolutely. It's all about people like you coming on. And I like to say that I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know a lot of smart people.
Yeah, well, you're humble and you underestimate your abilities.
All right. Thank you. Hey, so been in this industry for a long time, know a lot about extrusion, catheters, reflow, composite catheters, but really I don't know very much at all about implantable pacing leads and some of the MRI safety that goes along with them. So I'm really glad we're having this discussion. And I wanted to start off by, if you could kind of tell us, what is the gold standard currently for implantable pacing leads? Talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go into some other neuromodulation, for instance.
Yeah, historically, pacing has been done kind of at the bottom of the right side of the heart, right? They call it apical pacing. And if you're going to pace only the right side of the heart, which is fairly standard, they typically take the lead and they place it at the very bottom of the right side of the heart, apical pacing. And there have been several clinical studies published within the past probably 3 or 4 years that show that that's not the optimal treatment. It's not the optimal therapy for the patient. And if you can implant a lead or pace the patient a little more, let's call it physiologically or a little more naturally, and put the pacing signal or the stim signal a little bit closer to the cardiac conduction system. So the parts of the heart that actually carry the electrical signal from one location to another. You get a much better clinical outcome. And so there have been quite a few companies that we have worked with at Proton MedTech to innovate, to design and develop next generation pacing technologies. And conduction system pacing is probably one of the hot areas, within cardiac rhythm management. And so we typically do a lot of that front end design work or the innovation, build the initial prototypes, and then we fly in implanters. A lot of times they're cardiologists or electrophysiologists, and we implant in a live animal. And then we compare that therapy with, the historical standard, the apical pacing, and see what the difference in the clinical result is. The pacing efficiency, the pacing voltages, and see whether or not we can actually get a better method for pacing using conduction system pacing rather than the standard apical pacing.
Okay. The CSP, is it fairly new? Has it been around for 10 years, 20 years? How long has that been in place now?
Yeah, so apical pacing's been very popular for 70 or 80 years.
Okay. Wow.
Probably within the past 20 years, there's been kind of an evolution to pacing more towards or more closely to the cardiac conduction system. There's been a pacing technique called His bundle pacing.
Yes.
Which was popular 20 years ago, 10 years ago. It's still somewhat popular today. But within the past, really, it's only been like 3 or 4 years. And there have been
Okay.
kind of a lot of clinical data, a lot of clinical studies published that show for certain patient populations, especially for heart failure patients, conduction system provides a much better therapy, so a much improved clinical outcome.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about pain management and neuromodulation, implantable neuromodulation and the types of neuromodulation leads that are used in that therapy.
Yeah, and again, historically, the leads that have been used have been plugged into electronic pulse generator, so a
Mhm.
battery-operated electronic device that typically, for neuromodulation, provides a stimulation. So they stimulate the nerve where the pain signals being transferred, from wherever the pain originates
Mhm.
to your brain. And the neuromodulation lead signal will kind of interrupt that and prevent the pain signal from going from, if you have knee pain, going from the knee up into the brain. And so historically, they've used kind of, leads that are similar in construction to cardiac leads.
Mhm.
But in probably the past 5 to 10 years, there's been kind of an evolution in that technology where a lot of the leads are no longer plugged into a pulse generator. So you don't need that battery
Mhm.
electronic device with the hardware, firmware, software implanted in your body. And what they do is they implant only the lead. And these leads are small. I mean, they're less than 2
Mhm.
millimeters often, right? And so the diameter is small. They have a series of electrodes on one end, and they have the electronics actually built into the lead body,
Oh.
right? So they've got the ASICs, the application-specific integrated circuits. They've got capacitors. They've got a series of antennas to absorb the energy that is transmitted from outside the body through the skin to the lead that's implanted, um, you know, typically wherever the pain signal originates. And that's
Yeah.
that's a relatively new technology, and there are a couple of companies here in the U.S. that are actually leading the design, development, and the marketing of that technology. It's very exciting.
Hmm. You talked about the electronics, and there's probably an insulator, a polymeric insulator of some type, right? Whether it's silicone or polyurethane. Is that the case?
That is the case, yeah.
Okay.
And I actually have one of the leads here, right? And so this is a lead. You can see a series of electrodes on one end. There's an ASIC, the application-specific integrated circuit in here, and it's insulated by a couple of different layers of polymers, right? So there's
Mhm.
typically a layer of polyimide.
Ah.
There's a layer, and outside of that, there's sometimes a layer of things like PET, right, which is a great electrical insulator,
Mhm.
and then they often have another redundant layer of insulation on the outside of that, which you mentioned would be something like a silicone or a polyurethane. And so these systems are, they've got very complex, very complex structure of insulators and conductors, along with the implantable electronics, fit into a very small, again, less than 2 millimeter
Yeah.
diameter system.
I know a lot of work goes into the material selection, right, for long-term implant and oxidation and all these things, right? Especially with the polymers, right?
Yes.
And since it's implantable, it must take a very long time to get things approved.
Yeah, it does. But, luckily, there's a pretty rich history and knowledge base on what type of materials are best to use in these type of applications. And so, veterans of the industry, I might be considered one of those, have a little bit of experience having worked with a lot of super smart people, can kind of accelerate the selection of the materials and help rapidly design and build and test these type of systems. And so at Proton MedTech, that's what we do.
One disconnect for me, we're talking about implantable leads, and I hear a lot about leadless systems. So where's the disconnect there for me?
Yeah, so, leadless systems have been become popular for pacemakers, especially.
Mm-hmm.
For it's I think designed so that you reduce the clinical complications, especially the infection rate, right? Because anytime that you have a long system going from one part of your body to another part of your body, there's a higher risk of infection. Whereas with the leadless pacemakers, especially, you have a little capsule, right? And these capsules reduce the risk of infection because everything is actually in the blood pool. And there's nothing running actually, through your body and then comes, outside the blood vessel like a standard pacemaker would. And so there's been a lot of, kind of rapid evolution of leadless systems, especially leadless pacing systems. And I think there's one of the big strategics just came out with kind of a system that can pace and sense the right ventricle, and it can also sense, what they call the P wave, or the signal that where you sense the contraction of the right atrium. And that technology is going to evolve very rapidly. I mean, we've had projects here where we've done a lot of leadless systems, and we actually have one active system, one active project right now, where we will develop probably the first of its type leadless pacer for conduction system pacing, and be able to pace both the right atrium and the right ventricle. So it's an exciting new technology being developed by a little startup company that hired us to design it. And we are just about ready to start with the first initial prototype build. So very exciting.
Awesome. Very exciting. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the infection and the biofilms, and any implantable, it's a big deal, right? Even when I think about a PICC line or something like that in the body more than 30 days, the amount of hospital-borne infections and the extended stay and the cost to the patient and the hospital system is just astronomical.
It is. It is astronomical, right? And so, if you take a look at the cost of medical procedures, I mean, if a patient has to be re-hospitalized, right? So they have an implant or they have a procedure done, and if they have to be re-hospitalized, the cost of care skyrockets.
Yeah.
So, it's important for the medical community, and certainly the medical device community, that they minimize the risk of infections, especially the type of infections that would cause hospitalization. And so, as we, innovate and start developing these next generation medical devices, we kind of have to keep that in mind, right? So you want to design something that is going to minimize, the risk of clinical complications, especially infections.
Okay. Since they are implantable, and MRI has been the modality used for visualization, can you share a little bit about the materials that are used for MRI safety, and then the testing that goes along with that?
Yeah, so, of course you want to use non-magnetic materials best you can, but, when you're incorporating a lot of electronic devices, it's kind of hard to minimize or eliminate those materials. So what you want to do is say that, okay, we have to use, materials that are not completely compatible with resonant imaging, but let's make sure that it doesn't do any patient harm. Right. And so, a lot of the implantable medical devices that we design, build, and test here are for patients that have about a 50% chance of having an MRI, post-implant. So we have to do testing on almost every implantable medical device that we design here. And it's not trivial. It's fairly extensive. And part of the testing that we do in-house, right? So we have to inject certain types of energy, like RF type of energy, through our systems, and kind of measure the output. How does that transmit that energy from, for example, one end of the lead to the other end of the lead? And then when we, fully understand the properties of the medical device, we actually send it out to a lab, and there are probably somewhere between, maybe 5 to 7 labs in the world that can take this device and test it for kind of the full range of use conditions, right? So, a lead implanted in my body might take a different path and have a different curvature than a pacing lead implanted in your body, right? So, you have to make sure that for all clinical scenarios or all use conditions, that this system is going to be safe. And so this outside lab that we send our systems to will do that testing.
Pretty intensive testing, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's extensive and expensive, unfortunately, but there's no getting around it.
How long does that testing phase take typically?
At least 12 months.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Sometimes 15, 18 months. It depends, you have to work it out with these outside labs, see when they have time. They might not have availability for, 6 months out or something like that. So
yeah.
It's extensive.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. All the work that goes into it and the different types of leads and the neuromodulation. Thanks for sharing all that. And like I said, it's not an area that I have I'm very familiar with. And so I think there's a lot of people like me out there that'll enjoy listening and learning about it.
Yeah. And if anybody has any questions, I'd love to, communicate whatever information that I have to people who are interested in this area of medicine.
Okay. How do people get a hold of you in relation to this? Tell us a little bit about your company and some of these services and how you can reach out to you.
Yeah. So Proton MedTech is, I call it an innovation center, right? So, and I guess throughout my career, I've been, mainly focused on that front end design side of things. I worked for 3 of the big strategics. And then we opened up Proton MedTech in 2021. And, we've had several clients, both domestic clients as well as international clients come to us and say, we want to do this type of procedure. And a lot of times the procedure doesn't exist. The technology doesn't exist. So you're starting from scratch, and developing something new. And then you typically build the initial prototypes. Oftentimes it's with a physician or physician entrepreneur, and do as much bench testing as we can. And the bench testing, involves measurements of different properties of the medical device. Whether it's flow rate or impedance or resistance of the conductors or pacing pulses or whatever it might be, right? And we do a lot of that bench testing, and then we'll bring in fresh tissues a lot of times. So we'll call up one of the companies that provides fresh tissues. Sometimes it's heart, sometimes it's a different part of the anatomy, and we'll do fresh tissue testing. So we'll set up, for example, with a heart, we'll have it pulsate at 60 to 70 beats per minute at physiologic flow rates, somewhere around 5 or 6 liters per minute at physiologic pressures, something that goes up 120 over 80. And we try to set up the clinical conditions best we can, and then we do the implant, and we typically take an endoscope and stick it through the anatomy so we can actually see the interaction between the medical device and the tissue. And a lot of times that's really important. And then once we do, and we're satisfied with the design and think the design is going to work, then we set up cadaver studies and animal studies. And a lot of times we'll just run those studies as well, and try to do as much of that animal cadaver preclinical testing as is needed for us to get to proof of concept or that feasibility phase and say, okay, we have something that may be useful for a human clinical trial.
You mentioned use an endoscope for visualization to understand, to share a little bit more about that if you can.
Yeah. So, one of the big challenges, and I've seen probably, thousands of cases, live cases, and one of the difficulties that I think a lot of physicians have is, they have to use fluoroscopy or X-ray imaging basically to do the case, and they can't really see the interaction between the medical device and the tissue. So when we do like the fresh tissue testing, we use a clear liquid, oftentimes a saline solution, and pump that through the tissue. And then when we put the endoscope down there, we can actually see the interaction between the medical device and the tissue. And you can see things like, sometimes you want to implant a lead that's perpendicular to the tissue, right? And then we can see how perpendicular it is, or if it's off at an angle. So we might have to adjust the lead design. We might have to adjust the catheter design, or whatever. We have to adjust the design so that it can accommodate a more predictable clinical implant procedure.
Okay. Yeah, you got me on that one. And then the last question, as far as the delivery system for these leads, can you tell us a little bit how they're delivered and implanted?
Yeah. So there are a few different tools that are used. I mean, historically, they've like pacemaker leads have used like a stainless steel wire that they put through the center of the lead. It's called a stylet. And they steer the stylet into location, and then they have a helical electrode that spins and goes into the tissue, and that's how it's connected. And that helical electrode also carries electricity. Typically, it's a cathode or has a negative signal running to it. With some of the new pacing techniques, whether it's leadless pacing or conduction system pacing, cardiac resynchronization therapy, they use a catheter delivered system.
Okay.
And they'll take the lead and they can get it to a more precise location, or more desired location, or both, right? And then they take and they screw the lead into the tissue. And we've been involved with catheter type projects where we've had to be able to sense, to determine, or help the doctors determine if that is the right implant location before committing and before implanting the lead. So we'll do incorporate some sort of sensing into the catheter system, so they can say, yep, this is the right location for conduction system pacing or some other type of pacing. Now we can take the lead and implant it.
What is the center sensing in that case?
Yeah, so it has to be a conductive metal, right?
Okay.
And we're talking a lot about conduction system pacing. That's good because it's the future of pacing, or part of the important part of the future of pacing. And so typically the electrode for things like pacing leads or defibrillation leads are put on the surface of the tissue. With conduction system pacing, you actually have to put the or you should put the electrode into the tissue a lot further, right?
Mhm.
So instead of putting it 1 to 2 millimeters, it might have to go into the tissue 6 to 8 millimeters.
Okay.
But if you do that, you have to make sure that when you're putting it in deep inside, that you're actually close to the cardiac conduction system, right? And it's hard to determine with surface electrodes sometimes whether or not you're close to that cardiac conduction system. So you have to put some sort of metal conductor into the tissue and see how close you are to the cardiac conduction system.
Okay.
And so it makes the procedure a little more complex, but if you design the right implant tool, it goes pretty quickly.
Okay.
And it's not that much different from standard pacing implants.
Okay. Interesting. This has been a very interesting conversation, Scott, and I appreciate your time.
Steve, anytime. Yeah,
Okay.
all of our conversation. I love just all of our conversations. So anytime you want me to talk, either on the phone or in the podcast or whatever it is, just hit me up.
All right. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Talk to you later, buddy.
All right. All right.